welcome to episode 2, Develop. In this episode we're going to be looking over the Basics tab, which includes exposure, contrast, the highlights and the shadows, the Effects tab, which includes texture and dehaze, and then adjustment areas, which allows you to do all of those but to selective areas of your image. This section is probably going to have one of the biggest effects on the look of your image alongside colour. And therefore, as well as being very powerful in terms of getting your image to look better, it can also be overdone. You can put the blacks too far down so you can't see anything in the image. You can raise everything too high up and leave the image looking desaturated and artificial. And you can do the old classic of smashing the clarity slider up to 100 and everything looking just unbelievably fake. This is the first section where you're going to be able to make your own choices to how far you want to push your image. So you can alter it slightly just to make a slightly nicer image, or you can push it as far as you possibly can do to get more of a creative look to your image and more of a stylized final product. And because there's so much to get into, let's go straight to the computer. And welcome to Lightroom. So the first thing that we're going to do when we're looking at this image, it's already been pre-set up, it's been straightened and cropped, ready for Instagram in a 4:5 ratio. Straight away we can see it's quite dark, so we're going to look to boost the exposure, and ideally we're going to be looking to have the main section of the image be correctly exposed. So we want to be able to see it, but we don't want it to be too bright that it looks artificial. The main thing you're going to want to look at is this graph, and you want as much of it to be in this middle section as possible. If you're looking for a normally exposed image, you might be wanting it to be slightly darker, as we might do in this image, in which case the main bulk of it will be slightly lower down in the shadows. So left is shadows, right is highlights. So if we pull it all the way up, you can see that although now the main bulk of the image and the date of the image is in the middle, we're losing too much off the top end. One way you can fix that then is pull down the highlights, but we're still losing too much. So what we're going to do is adjust the image further down and then correct from there. So in the Basics tab, you can control the different areas of lights and darks in the image, from the highlights and the shadows, which are not the extremes, lights and darks, but the majority next to the extremes, and then the whites and blacks, which are the extremes, the exposure, which is the overall brightness of the image, the contrast, which is the difference between the highlights and the shadows, which if it's less difference, more of a standard grey image. Higher, you've got really high brights you can see at the top and really dark shadows at the bottom. Let's reset that. And we've then got the texture and the clarity, which are a form of smart contrast, so that finds areas in the image where there is an obvious difference, so some lights to darks, and then makes a difference to those areas of the image. Clarity especially can be really easily overdone. Texture does the same thing but on a slightly smaller level, so it almost looks like a sharpness thing that you're increasing. And we've then got vibrance saturation, which we might play with a tiny bit in this episode, but we're going to look at more in the colour episode next. So for this image, because we know we've got a really bright sky, we're going to lift the shadows to see if we can match that. Pull the highlights down so we can see a little bit more in the sky. It looks a little bit washed out, so you can see there's lots of greys and no real blacks, there's no definition to the image. So we're going to pull the blacks down, lift the whites up to give it a little bit more pop, and then we've got a much better image already. Now, that's me going in knowing roughly what I want from an image. The easiest way for most people, and what I do a lot of the time, is just to press auto and work from there. So let's see what that gives us. So it does many of the things that we just did. Drop the shadows down, lift the highlights up, drop the blacks a bit and add a little bit to the whites. It's also added a tiny bit of contrast, and normally auto adds around 15 to the vibrance and keeps saturation roughly where it was. But for this image, what we see is the sky's really bright, we've got no colour there, it's perfectly white, we've lost a lot of the information. So I can pull this down even further, we gain a little bit more, and pull the exposure down even more, and then we've actually got some sort of colour in the image. Now, the colour in this image isn't great. I'm going to do a few quick temperature and tint adjustments to see if we can get more what we'll do with the final product. Although these sections are colour based, and we will cover those in the next episode, looking at the temperature, the tint, the vibrance and the saturation are really important when making the general brightness and contrast adjustments on your image. So again, you can go for auto, lift a bit of the purples. That's about what I want for this image. There's a colour dropper, again, that'll go into the next episode as to how to get what should be the ideal white balance. I'm going to add a little bit of vibrance, a little bit of saturation to it, and go from there. So, we've now got roughly what is a much better image than we started with, which if I turn on the difference, apart from the obvious slope and the crop, you can see we can now see things a lot clearer. There's much more brightness in the image, but also, especially if you drop those darks down a little bit more, we've refined the image as well, so it's got more contrast and a lot more pop. The next thing we're going to look at is what's called the presence slider. So these are the texture, clarity and dehaze. As standard, I like to give a little bit of each of these, but they're a lot more useful in adjustment layers that we'll cover on later. So texture, we could put that right up. It gives a really, really sharp, really detailed, but overly processed image. So add a little bit to that. Clarity, again, if we wrap the whole thing up, really dramatic, but really, really overdone. And also it creates a lot of haloing. So that's these little white areas you can see around the buildings, where it's trying to create that contrast but goes too far and makes a really horrible effect. So we'll put that down. Again, I normally go for about 5 to 10 for each of these. And dehaze, which is really useful for bringing detail out in skies, but if you do it to the whole image, it just ends up looking mucky. But you can see there's quite a bit more detail in the sky than there was when it's blank. So adding 5 to that. And with that, we've got our base, exposure, contrast for this image. Now, to really make the image pop, we're going to add colour, but first we're going to look into adjustment layers. Now, adjustment layers are hugely powerful and one of my favourite things to use in Lightroom. They allow it to do any of the settings we've just done, but to certain areas of the image, and there are 3 different types of them, which we'll look at each of. There's also the ability to use masking with these layers. So that is to select a certain image of the layer and then to have Lightroom automatically refine what you're editing by either colour or the brightness. So let's go into one of those now, and the most obvious and my favourite one of these to use, once we get back to full screen, is to do the sky. So you come up to here, these are your 3 adjustment areas. First one we're going to look at is a graduated filter. So you can drag and pull this down. It has a gradient from the top line to the bottom line of the settings, and if you press shift and drag, it will automatically give you a perfectly straight line with the image. So I'm going to make that fairly narrow and then pull this down and drop it there, because what we're going to look at is the sky. I'm going to pull down the highlights even more, which you can see has already given us, again, a bit more colour. Give a little bit more saturation to the sky. And then dehaze is basically the sky filter. So if we put dehaze up, you see we've got a lot more detail and it's a lot punchier. But then for dehaze, you compensate by lifting either the blacks or the shadows. So in this case, I'm going to lift the shadows a bit and the blacks a little bit. And you can see, although I've kept that detail that I gained from the dehaze, it doesn't look quite as dark. Now, the main thing you can see in this is that we've got a lot of darkness suddenly appearing in the buildings because we've dehazed them. You can go and use the brush tool, turn on your mask overlay, so the red bit is whatever you have selected, and erase and paint out every bit that you don't want and zoom in and be really precise about it. But there's a lot easier way than that, and that is by going down to the range mask. So for this case, because we're doing the sky, we know that luminance or brightness is going to be a really obvious way to see what we're looking at. So you turn on the luminance mask, and then again in this range, the left is the shadows, the right is the highlights. So and whatever is between these two dots is what we're selecting. So if I were to pull down the highlights, it's only selecting the shadows. And as we now want, if we pull up the shadows, you can see that it's cut out the buildings. And if we turn off the luminance mask, we can now see that the buildings are no longer dehazed and look a lot more natural. This works the same if you were to go into colour. You can use a colour dropper to select a certain colour of what you've highlighted, and the effect will only be applied to that colour inside the highlighted region. And as we can see, the difference that is having on the sky make it a lot more dramatic. The next filter we're going to look at is the radial filter. So the radial filter does the exact same thing as a gradient filter, but out from a circle. So by default, we're making everything brighter, and it's everything that is outside of the circle. So if you click the invert, you can then edit anything inside the circles. So it's whether you want to exclude something from the edit or include it in the edit. In this case, we're going to look at the waves. So you can rotate and change the size of the filter. So I'm going to rotate it and filter it just on the cresting waves. I've checked inverters at everything that's inside, and all I'm going to do, push up the clarity a little bit and bring up the whites just to give a little bit more focus onto those cresting waves. As you can see, again, adjustment layers are really dependent on what you want to do with the image, and they're really creative. It's something where you've got to decide where you want to place them and what you want to do inside or outside of that particular area. The final one, which again ties into that same thing, is the brush. So the brush is up here in the top right, and as you can see, you then get this pointer when you've selected it. You can change the size, the feather, which is a gradient so it falls off, so it can be nice and soft, or if I turn the feather down, it'd be really, really hard. Turn that one up. Then the flow, it means it has less of an effect, but as you brush over it and keep going over it, has more and more the more you cover the area. Undo that one. Right. So I'm going to turn the flow up, and I'm going to use this to mask out the building. So just roughly go onto the main bit of Abrasive Pier here, put the size down, just so I can cover the end. And now, as you can guess, what I'm going to do is go down to Luminance Masking, select Show Luminance Mask, and take off the highlights. And you can still paint in while in this mode, just to make sure that we've got all the bits that we want, and turn it off again. That looks fairly unrealistic, so what we're going to do is take this down, up the shadows, add a little bit of texture onto it just to sharpen it up, and then drop the black. Now, another tip that you can do just to check what your progress is with all of these is whenever you're using any masking layer, you can come down to this little switch in the bottom corner, which turns off all the adjustments that you've made with the brush tool. So I can see from doing this quickly, it's probably a little bit too much under there. So I can go back to the luminance mask, pull down a little bit more of the highlights, turn to erase, got a fairly small feather on there, just brush away a little bit of the underneath that I didn't want to catch, turn off the mask, and I'm pretty happy with that. I'm now going to run through a few quick tips and tricks for using masks. First one, if you want to re-edit a mask you've already edited, click on the type of mask it was, hover over the image, and there will be dots around where that was, and then you can alter it and go back to refine it, and then press done. Second one, next, is I normally quite like to have a mask coming in from the bottom of the image, just with a little bit of highlights and whites down, because then it leads you into the image and you don't go out the bottom of the image visually. Masks are also really useful to do with the texture and clarity sliders. So using a radial mask here, just to select under the pair, invert it, reset the exposure, turn up the texture, just so we've got a bit more on these struts. Then I'm going to go down to luminance again, show the luminance mask, turn it down so we can see we've only got the struts, brush out the bits that I don't want that it has then selected with a large feather, press done, and we've sharpened up the struts. And finally, something a little bit more dramatic, select the area where we've got all these really nice trails that have come from the tide. Again, double click on exposure to set it back to 0, because that's the preset for mask that I've got going at the moment. Put up the clarity, drop the blacks, boost the whites and the contrast a bit, readjust this, change the angle, lift the shadows slightly, and increase the texture. Which, as you can see, makes a massive difference to how dramatic that bottom corner of the image is. But if I were to do this over the entire image, it makes it look absolutely terrible. So just a little bit in something that is less dramatic, adding a lot of clarity can bring some drama back into it. Looking at what we've done overall in the image then, if we can go on to the before and after view, as well as straightening the image as we did before, you can now still see the pier a lot clearer, the struts are sharp, there's interest in the sky and interest in this duller area in the bottom corner, while also it fades out into black to stop your eye going out the bottom of the image too much. We've got drama in the curve of the wave that we added, and we've got nice definition on the building. This just shows how powerful editing the brightness, contrast, the creative contrast such as the texture and the clarity can have to an image, as well as how powerful adjustment areas can be into making a massive difference onto the look of your overall image. Now you could post that one on the right, it would be fine, it'd be better. Maybe we could go and change the colours a bit if you wanted to, but that's what we're going to focus on in the next episode. And once that next episode is done, we're going to see another marked improvement to how your image presents. So that was episode 2, develop. The next episode we're going to go on to is episode 3, which is colour. Now, develop makes a massive impact to your images. Colour does exactly the same but in a different way. Obviously we're going to look at the saturation of colour in images, the vibrance, which is another form of saturation, but we're also going to go into the HSL sliders. So this allows you to edit the colour of each colour, so you can make greens yellower or more blue. You can also then play with the brightness of greens as opposed to yellows or reds, or the saturation of each individual colour as well. So you can see how that could make a really big difference to how your image looks. We're then also going to go into camera calibration, which can do some of the same things, as well as start to introduce colours overall into the shadows for some really good creative looks, and then see if we can tie that all together to create a really nice looking image ready to go into Photoshop. That'll be coming out next week. Hit subscribe on the channel, comment on this if you've got any questions which I'll answer for you, and I'll see you next time. And adjustment layers, which are some of the most powerful This episode is no. All of the in this oh, you. That bird is doing my head in. That bird. Can't even remember what I was going to say.